Most faces look familiar, but as per our custom, since some people can get to some lectures and not to other lectures, and I don't want to presume necessarily. So what I'm going to do to begin this evening is simply remind you the journey we took yesterday, morning and evening, very, very briefly. And we're going to pick up, as we were closing last night, we were working on the Eden story, Adam and Eve and the serpent, and exploring the idea that maybe counter many of our training in Sunday school and growing up and our sort of Christian assumptions about this text, highly influenced by Paul as being all about the fall, or original sin on the part of humankind, that there might be something else to think about with regard to what happens in this garden. So that's what we're going to pick up with tonight. My goal is to work through Cain and Abel this evening too. There's a lot to be done on that story. As infamous as all these stories are, there's much more to see in the Cain and Abel story. And then I'll talk some about the intervening material, the rise of civilization and the arts and so on. There are intervening texts that we often skip over between Cain and Abel and the flood narrative. And my hope is we might culminate this evening with the flood and the covenant. We'll try to get through the flood to get to the covenant on the other end. But we'll see how the evening unfolds, and what we don't get to tonight, I'll pick up with again tomorrow night. The goal is, of course, to try to cover all the way through the Tower of Babel story and into the promises made to Abraham and Sarai on tomorrow night's lecture. So that's where I'm moving. You may feel for quickness, for quickly or not so quickly, depending on how you're feeling. So, let's, if you will, turn it. Hopefully everybody has a Bible or can look on with somebody who does. I'd like us to turn to Genesis 3. This is a slide we were working on at the end of our discussion last night. And we began actually with this garden scene. I'm going to focus this in on a couple of verses here again. But we began, of course, by the possibility of a more sympathetic reading of the serpent. You'll remember I tried to make the case that the adjective used to describe the serpent, that is, arum, actually has a more favorable rendering, particularly in the wisdom literature in the book of Proverbs. That is, it can mean clever, even prudent. It is an aspect that is often ascribed to the wise, is sought after by the wise, and distinguishes them from the naive or even the foolish ones. So the serpent in the garden poses some questions, and we were working through that last night. I'd like to direct our attention, however, particularly to verse 6. After the dialogue with the serpent, you may recall, we'll rehearse it just so we step right into the story with these characters. You shall not eat from any tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, for the tree that is in the midst of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, so there is this sense that the eating of the fruit will impart to Adam and Eve some sort of knowledge, that is, knowledge that distinguishes between good and evil, and that capacity to make that distinction is a hallmark of divinity, a hallmark of being a deity, having divine knowledge. So here's the moment I want us to focus on particularly, because the narrator actually takes great pains to invite us into the interior world of Eve. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took from it and she ate. Several recent interpreters, and Carol Newsom at Emory University and some others, talk about this moment as a moment that is about desire. Even the word desire itself figures in the text. The tree is to be desired to make one wise. Here in the garden, it's almost pre-rational thought, right? This isn't yet about knowledge, but there is this sense that the tree is appealing, tree is beautiful, the tree is appetizing, offers appetizing fruit, and that the tree might just grant a kind of knowledge. If we hold Eve in a moment of desire here, we are invited to think about the whole notion of what desire does for us. When the serpent, let me say it a little differently, what the serpent is doing in essence is inviting Adam and Eve to look at something and think of it now as indispensable to their very selves. Desire often functions in our lives to crystallize lack and what we think we need in order to fill that lack. It is, in other words, a way of setting boundaries, defining boundaries. What one desires typically lies beyond one's reach. And when, here's a wonderful quote from Carol, the thing I desire is different from me, outside of me, but I want to draw it into myself. I want it to be mine because even though I never knew I lacked it before I saw it, this thing or this person now appears a necessary part of myself. Rather than, that is, thinking Eve is in a moment of knowledge, we hold Eve in a moment where she's now been invited by the serpent to desire something she didn't previously desire. And all of the cues for what prompts desire, that is, aesthetic beauty, appetite, and the possibility it might lead to knowing, prompt her to act on her desire and eat. In the moment that she does this, she actually does, her eyes are opened, right? Their eyes are opened, both Adam and Eve. Of course, that's a buzzword, that's a phrase that signals there is now an awareness. There is a knowledge that comes from eating of this fruit. But we noted last night that the knowledge is actually not at all what we would expect based on the narration. We expect the knowledge, the narrator should say, they ate of the fruit and they now know the distinction between good and evil. But what happens instead throws a wrench in the narrative. What happens instead is that they eat, their eyes are opened, and what do they now perceive? That they are naked. Are animals naked? I mean, have you ever really thought about it? So they're in this moment. So part of what's happening in the garden, several interpreters doing wonderful work on this. One of the things that's happening in the garden is that boundaries are being defined and distinctions are being defined. What happens when they recognize they are naked in that moment is they now know they are not animals. Right? The animals aren't naked. Humans are naked. And in that moment of self-awareness, they're now not, they're with the animals, but they are not animals. And yet, do they yet know what it is to be godlike? Right? We're somewhere in between. Once we recognize we're naked, we have self-awareness. They now are quite aware of their bodies within the garden. And self-awareness, of course, is linked to self-consciousness, which when pressed, which is what's going to happen in this narrative, when pressed, can lead to shame and guilt, and to self-centeredness. Okay, why am I doing all this? First thing I'm trying to say is, the word sin doesn't happen in this narrative. Different kinds of words happen in this narrative. Words like knowing, good and evil, eyes opening, pleasantness and desirability, and then nakedness and being ashamed. So what are the connections? Is there a hand? Please.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, as far as the narrative goes, this is the first time that we see that Adam and Eve rebelled.
Yes. Yes.
They had always done what, as far as we can tell,
For the little
they've
while.
always done what God had asked them to do,
Yes.
and not done what God had asked them
Yes.
not to do.
Yes.
This is the first time they rebelled.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that is really the essence of this knowing good and evil. They only knew good before. Everything was good. God pronounced it good.
Yes.
They only knew good,
Yes.
and now they've gone against God.
Yes.
Only once.
Only one.
One little bite.
But you know what? Yeah, only one little bite. Yeah, the whole world doesn't have to know, right? You're a cartoon like that. But the funny thing backwards, because clearly Eve has some sense, even before she eats of the fruit, that there are good things and bad things to do, right? She knows she's not supposed to eat of that tree. She knows that's a bad choice. In fact, she knows it's such a bad choice that she fences it in, right? She says, I'm not going to eat of that tree. So one of the interpretive quandaries that keeps sort of percolating up in interpretations of this story is, well, if it's simply about knowing good action from bad action, she already seems to have a sense of that. Right? It may be a flaw in the narration. The narrator might have actually blown it. But since we only have the story we have, there's a sense that there is some sort of, so there is a sense of obedience and disobedience even before eating the fruit. Right?
From what's there in the text, it could be a sense of what's right and wrong, or what's safe and dangerous.
And safe and dangerous.
And now the
boundaries.
serpent says, yeah, but you know, it isn't dangerous.
That's right. It's all of, this is why the text, yes, this is why the text in many ways, thank you for that.
She doesn't know she's doing anything wrong, she's just become a risk taker.
She's crossing boundaries. The text is a lot about boundaries. Can I say that one more time? The text is a lot about boundaries. Boundaries between human and animal. Boundaries between God, or gods, the heavenly realm, and the human. Boundaries between humans and creatures, right? It's all, we're getting a lot of boundaries set here. So you're right, it may not be about moral terms, good and bad, or knowing wickedness and righteousness, for example. But it is about recognizing there are, in God's garden, if you remember last night, we spent a lot of time saying, when God plants this garden and puts the Adam in there, God gives the Adam a vocation, permission and provision, and a prohibition. The serpent is the first character in the Bible to say, let's take what's a given and think of it as an option. Right? Let's take a step back and look at the garden and think that maybe the prohibition is an optional exercise. Once we do, we're going to cross a boundary. We're going to cross a boundary.
Is that word that you said was so important last night, Aram,
yes.
as a part of this story?
Yes, yes. Craftiness and shrewdness, the adjective of that. Yeah, the serpent's doing what probably a really crafty, clever person would do, asking questions.
But not about Eve.
But not about Eve. Not about Eve, yeah. Yes, please.
I was just thinking that the writer of this text and us know a lot more about God than she did. I mean, it took the people a long time to learn lots of different things about God. So isn't there also the aspect of just because God said something, you know, there's not that sense of, God's is all perfect, all-knowing, always correct. I mean, why wouldn't she maybe question this prohibition? Well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's
a
great question. To really address your question, which is an interesting question to think about, to really address your question, we have to fill in a lot of gaps. Right? What do they know about God?
Yeah.
When do they know it about God? We're only in chapter 3, verse whatever 6. So we don't have the. You're right. That if you're thinking of the scriptures as sort of an unfolding story of humanity's understanding of who God is and who we are in the world, we're at the very, very beginning.
I mean, they sure were making a lot of blunders, but
yes. But here,
thousands of years later,
what they clearly know is that they're living in God's garden. Right. God has provided for them. They are creatures of God. And they have an accountability of God, to God. That's at least a given in the garden. What the serpent invites is a let's step out and think about it as an optional exercise. And that leads to boundary crossing. And the boundary crossing that happens with the eating of the fruit is first and foremost not this knowledge of good and evil necessarily, although that's going to come. It is an awareness of the self. The narrator invites us to think of nakedness, the body, and an accompanying shame, guilt. They've crossed the boundary. Now the world looks different. They look differently to themselves. So can you hold that thought and we'll see what happens?
Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't count for today anymore.
It wouldn't count for today? What wouldn't count?
Well, if people go to a nudistic camp, they are not even allowed to put clothes on.
No, actually, I like that comment. We're all sort of chuckling. I like it because part of what this narrative is pressing is choice. Part of what this narrative is pressing is choice, and why it's really important to keep that in mind is because if you read this narrative through the Christian lens of This is about an original sin, a flaw built into our very being that is exacerbated in this story and brought to light. That's not what this text is talking about. This text is talking about she's prompted by desire, and she chooses to eat of the fruit. In the way people might choose to go to a nudist colony, in which case the nakedness might not be a point of shame. No? So, let's see how can I move us in the narrative so we see how this unfolds. So we laughed last night. My last thought was, you need to think about fig leaves, and we all had a great chuckle about how fig leaves have resin on them that cause blistering and burning and rashes and discomfort. And so their attempts to cover in their shame only leads to irritation. But then let's go to the next scene, because it's quite important. Chapter 3, verse 8. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. Okay. This is the Yahwist writing, right? This is an anthropomorphic notion of God. This is a God who this is the potter God who forms and molds, and the gardener God who plants a garden, and so on. This is the God who likes to stroll in the garden in the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves in the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So the first reaction when one is self-aware and guilty, feeling shame, is to hide oneself. They do that. But the Lord God called out to the Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" What is God's first action in this story, besides walking around in the garden, in this scene? Seeking and asking questions. One of the things, if you continue to follow the character of God through Genesis, God often steps on the stage and engages the human or the human community by asking questions. It's going to be echoed later in the Abraham-Sarah stories, in Pharaoh and other characters that have encounters with Abraham's family and so on. What have you done? Have you done this? What were you thinking, right? There is a way in which God steps into a teaching, if not at sometimes a prosecutorial role, a role of sort of court scene. But God begins by asking questions. Now, we can have all the conversation you would like, and I'm sure some of you will want to have it. Well, God already knows the answers to these questions, right? This is simply the omnipotent God being a teacher. Perhaps. But the narrator doesn't seem all that concerned. The narrator about what God knows and what God doesn't know. What the narrator is concerned about is that God asks questions and invites, in the moment by doing so, human self-reflection. Let me give you the contrast. If God walked through the garden and said, if God walked through the garden and said, "You're hiding yourselves, you're ashamed, you ate of the fruit of the tree." It's a different kind of scene, yes? In the moment, God invites self-reflection. At the very moment, they are self-conscious, self-aware. So here's what happens. The Lord God, where are you? And the Adam says, if you mark in your Bibles here where you circle, here's where you circle all the first common singular speech. I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. What has happened? Shame and guilt and self-centeredness, arguably. Is the Adam particularly concerned about where Eve is at this moment? No. Is the Adam particularly concerned about the serpent and the scene? No. They hide themselves. But when pressed, the Adam resorts to first-person speech and locates his actions in fear. I was afraid, so I hid myself. So God says, again, asking a question, let's reflect on this some more together. Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat? Did you cross the boundary? God says. And the man says, well, here it is. The woman, we've been waiting for this, right? Since last night, you're waiting for it. The woman whom you gave to me She gave me from the fruit of the tree and I ate. Okay, so here we begin the quintessential passing of the buck. It's going to happen all the way through the scriptures, and it happens into our own present space and time. The woman whom you gave to me. Notice this is really interesting. The human's first reaction is not to ask for forgiveness. God, I did it. I ate the fruit of the tree. I'm really sorry. That is not the human's first instinct in this story. The human's first instinct is A, is to hide, and B, to pass blame on somebody else, including God. Okay, well, the woman doesn't do any better, I hate to tell you. So then the Lord God turns to the woman and says, what is this you've done? And the woman says, the serpent tricked me, and I ate. Okay, so what's happening in the scene if you're pushing through the thesis that what happens in the garden is really a coming to self-awareness. And in the moment, accompanied with shame and guilt, that then leads to a self-centered, self-defensive, self-protective instinct, motivated by fear and shame, and then ultimately to a separation from one's partner in this case. Right? We started off, they were in the garden, they were naked and they weren't ashamed. Now they're naked, or they're covered in fig leaves and scratching a lot, and they are ashamed. And now they're blaming each other, or blaming other creatures in order to justify their situation. Okay, we're not going to, for sake of time, we're not going to work all the way through the cursing formula that follows. But let me note this. The curses are descriptive of the way the world is. They are not prescriptive. That is, this is a description of a distorted creation. This is a description. This isn't the initial plan. This isn't the way it was supposed to work out. And arguably, it's not an inevitable, in this story world, it's not an inevitable outcome. If you believed in the original sin, this would be an inevitable outcome. In this story world, it's not an inevitable outcome. So the world, this is the world in the way it should not be. This is the world quite different than Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. What was mutuality and equality, male and female are the image of God, Adam and Eve are a helper and partner one to another, is now about control and distortion. Many interpreters will emphasize that the cursing formulas that follow are all about etiology, all about explaining origins. Why is it snakes don't have legs? Why is it that people, particularly women, hate snakes? Why is it that childbirth is painful? Why is it that there is sexual desire? Why is it that men dominate women? Why is it that work is burdensome? Why do we sweat and toil? And why is it that people die? In a very short few verses, through the results of this action, we get stories of explanation for why these aspects of lived reality are, in fact, what they are. So, notice, of course, that part of this distortion is alienation, conflict within creation between humans and creatures. There is distorted relations between men and women, and, of course, between the woman and the serpent. So, we started this story in 2:25. They're naked and not ashamed. By the end of the story in 3, it's going to continue to reverberate, but at the end of 3, the humans are alienated from their bodies. They are alienated from one another. They are alienated from God. And they are alienated from the created world. And that reality is what then informs present lived reality. But it was not God's intent, arguably. Until somebody comes and says, well, somebody put the serpent in the garden. right? Somebody put the tree in the garden, right? If this is God's garden, and then your head starts to explode. Because you can't hold. This is one of the great things about this story is you can argue through this is disobedience. This is the first sin. This was an inevitable outcome of the human person. You can argue this was choice. This wasn't inevitable. This is prompted by desire. She had until she grabbed the fruit. She had the choice not to eat. And, by the way, the man also had the choice not to take the fruit from the woman when she offered it to him, right? Both people had choice. And the outcome didn't have to fall out the way it did. But no matter which sort of way you go with this story and try to press it, pieces don't fit. There's always some have you ever taken a water-warped puzzle and trying to put it together again, and that piece just keeps popping up, you can't make it all stay flat? This narrative will not stay flat, no matter how you press it. So if you decide the serpent is just another creature in the garden, well, fine, but somebody put the serpent in the garden, and were the questions inevitable? And there are those two trees, one of which I need to talk about. So here are the questions, and I've tried to sort of open a new way of thinking about this story, hopefully for some of you. Is this a fall? Is this story, the three story, is it a fall, as we are so prone in Christian circles to call it? Is it a growing up? Some of you are glaring at me. I'm not buying it for a second. Is this, and this is David Carr, Old Testament scholar in New York, an accurate reflection of the painful process of maturing? Right? How do you, those of you who've raised children, I don't have my own children, I have nieces and nephews. I can testify as an aunt. That oftentimes the way we learn our boundaries and the way we actually mature, morally and otherwise, is by crossing the boundaries and figuring out where the limits are, right? So disobedience can actually lead to ways of knowing that are about perceptiveness, discernment, and right living. So Walter Brueggemann says of this story, it's a reflection on what knowledge can do to a community. An assertion that the recognition and honoring of boundaries leads to well-being. Now, some would push back at that and say, well, whose boundaries? What boundaries? Who defines boundaries? And then if you press the question to say, well, ultimately what Adam and Eve needed to learn that they didn't learn until they ate of the fruit was that they should trust the vocation, permission, and prohibition in the garden. So what do you think?
Don't buy it.
You don't buy it. Rob, please.
Well, I like Carr's formulation better than Brueggemann's because it seems to me, okay, maybe if we were in Eden, none of this would be necessary. Okay, I'll get that. But it seems to me that a great deal of what has been achieved in human history that's worth considering as good was done by pushing boundaries.
Yes. Yes.
So there are, now, again, okay, in Eden maybe there was one boundary, and that one you don't push. But,
and we learned the hard way.
yeah. But at least since then,
Yes.
it seems to me, I mean, after all, particularly in the Old Testament, you've got boundaries being pushed all through the scriptures, and it turns out well.
Yes. Yes.
Josiah's reforms, and he's pushing some pre-existing boundaries.
Correct.
Prophets are pushing boundaries all the time. Now, they're not God's boundaries, I do get that, but still, I think Brueggemann, maybe there's more to it that I haven't read in that small passage there, but it seems to me that that's a little bit, that gets close to it's God's will, and therefore...
And I think that's what he's trying to argue. But the trick to the Brueggemann reading, of course, is to be able to say you know quite clearly, right? This is exactly your point. What is God's will and what is God's boundary? In the garden, they did, and they pressed it, and we rightly pressed them. But to the larger point, boundary crossing is actually the way in which people learn their own self-location in the world, and they learn to push into new forms of knowledge. So especially in the last 20 years or so, many readers are going back to Genesis 3 and saying, this is really a story about moral maturity. This is a story about growing up. They are expelled into the real world that we all live in, and this is the explanation of how it happened. So we were talking after class last night about this quote, and I wanted to add it. I wanted to tweak it. Can I just read the quote, and then I'll take the last comment. In Eden, humankind, and this will sit with you or not. I'm obviously not trying to persuade everybody on this. But in Eden, humankind has a choice between wisdom and life. In Eden, humankind has the choice between wisdom and life. And guess what we chose? Wisdom. We chose wisdom.
And who is that?
It's actually several. It's all over the biblical commentaries. And I tried to go back today per our conversation to find the original quote, and I couldn't find it. I'll keep looking. But in Eden, a lot of people are quoting this. In Eden, we're given the choice between wisdom and life. Life in the garden, right? And what did we choose? We chose the fruit that was desired to make one wise.
So you cannot present this really to children. If you say that...
I could not present this here.
No. If you say, well, this is very healthy, it's beautiful, and it gives you knowledge and wisdom, that's everything what you want for a child. And then suddenly you're punished because you have too much knowledge.
Well, I
I'll
don't know.
let that stand. There we go.
I grew up with a mom who's like, you always have your nose in a book. You're going to get too smart. You're going to learn too much.
See what happened?
So there was something too that it's inevitable for most people to want to learn. I think. Or for me.
But, I mean, I think clearly there's a fall. They're kicked out of the garden. They're going to have to work under the toil and all these things.
So there are consequences.
Well,
There are consequences.
But it's not a fall.
How can you say, I don't buy that that's not a fall. What, I mean, yes, it's the world we live in
I'd love to be back
now.
in me. It's a lot. The fall language, of course, carries all the freight of the Christian
Okay.
interpretations of it.
Making
So,
you living by the sweat of your brow and being
Yeah,
kicked out of the garden.
which is why you'll see. I'm getting to the tree of life in a minute. But it's why I use language of expulsion. Actually, some have said for the Christian interpretation, it really hold a lot of weight, even more firmly. It ought to draw from the language of the text, which is it's not that it's a fall from some sort of perfect state to a fall into an imperfect state, but it is about choice. A choice for wisdom and the consequences of it that lead to expulsion. There are consequences. So we could call this the story of expulsion.
Okay.
Okay.
If that somehow seems better, but
But it is important because fall suggests, the only reason I was raising it is because you were saying, well, it's clearly a fall. And I'm saying, I'm not so sure, because when you say it's clearly a fall, you're assuming a certain Christian interpretation.
well, fall from
of the story.
grace, and you're saying that they still have just as much grace when now they have. I don't know.
Yes,
I mean,
in fact, we do say that.
okay.
We do say that. And in fact, God clothes them. Actually, God clothes them in a garment, catch a net, that is a garment that is reserved for kings, royalty. So they are not expelled they're not expelled donned in sackcloth, right? They're actually expelled still with some authority, divinely granted, to carry out their charge in the world. So there is so the whole question of is there less, are they somehow less than as a result of this, is a subject that's clearly a lively one amongst us, yes.
David Hick has a really interesting explanation
Yeah,
of this
please.
particular piece. And it's one that I kind of am drawn to. He draws it all around that particular point, grace.
Yes.
There's no need for grace if there isn't a trespass. And if the entire notion of God's plan is to bring us to a state of grace, this has to happen.
No, but we're already in a state of grace, so it doesn't have to happen.
There's no need for grace if there's no, yeah, exactly. And there's also the piece that he brings in that love is the greatest piece of it. Mm-hmm. And that for us, as creatures, to truly love God, we truly have to have free will. At some level, we have to be able to say no.
Yep.
Even if it's at a relatively low, but that has to
This
exist.
text, in the form that we have it, does place a premium on choice, decision making, and the consequences that leads to. And what we learn actually in the moment, because I'm going to move us, oh my gosh, I need to move us. There's a whole flood waiting for us. What was it? Now I got so excited about the flood, I lost my train of thought.
Clothes.
Oh yes, clothes. Oh, grace and clothes. Okay, yes, grace. So we get these garments of skin. So we're also learning. We've learned something about the human, and we may be unsettled about what we've learned about the human, and that's perfectly okay. A lot of us are spending a lot of our days wondering what happened in this story. So we're not going to settle it here tonight. But one of the things we also learn is that God yet, even though the decreed punishment at the very beginning of the story, if you remember all the way back there, was if you eat of this fruit, you shall die. What we find in the end is an expression, to use language that's not in the text but is certainly appropriate to the text. We find an act of grace where God goes ahead and makes a garment, clothes them in suitable clothing as opposed to fig leaves. And then there's this interesting thing. God says, see, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now he might reach out in his hand and take also from the tree of life and live forever. You know, this really bothers readers. Is God scared that the human's going to do something? Text might be read that way. There is clearly concern they're going to eat of this tree and have maybe arguably immortality. That's how it's typically construed. What's also interesting, one way to think of this, this notion that the human now has knowledge of good and evil. Carol Newsom, elsewhere in another piece that she's done on this text, she talks about how, if you remember in the ancient Near Eastern creation stories, one of the things I insisted yesterday repeatedly was, when the human is formed, the human is a mixture, right? It's a mixture of clay and God's blood, or a spirit and spit and wind and mud, right? There's always this sense that the human, in some way, is of the soil, like the animals, and has something divine-like in the mix. This story has a similar testimony. In that, you've got, and Carol uses computer, like those of you who are computer people will be able to understand this better than I, but it is as though the human has an animal hardware, but by eating of the fruit of the tree injects, may I not ruin this, injects godlike software. Does that sort of work?
Yeah.
And the result is you have again a human that is a mix and is in between boundaries, not animal and not God. And God here is actually going to make sure of that by expelling them from the garden so that they dare not eat of the tree of life. So we're again in Israel's own story a mix. There's something about us that is not animal, and there's something about us that is not God. So, the tree of life. Can I say two things about the tree of life? Mm-hmm. I think I've talked with you about the tree of life before. But a very interesting thing is going to happen at the end of this story, before we turn to Cain and Abel. A very interesting thing happens. We are kept away from the tree of life. Right? They're expelled. This is part of the consequence. They are now sent out of the garden in their garments of skin. I had a student a year ago say, Professor Yoder, what poor animal had to give up its skin? And I thought, I'd never thought about it, honestly. I never thought about it, and of course that lost me for about 5 months. The narrator's not concerned about it, but there were clearly people right.
But it's a
Do
good.
You know?
No, but it's a good leading into grace.
It is.
Something has to die.
Something had to die for you. Exactly. Yeah, but it's so funny. I hadn't even thought about it. Right? And it was a detail I just got over. In any case, the tree of life at the end of Genesis 3 is kept. What you cannot get to the tree of life by the end of Genesis 3. Flaming sword is guarding the garden, so you cannot get back to it. Now, the tree of life, which is a significant ancient Near Eastern symbol, we find it in iconography across the ancient world. In Egypt, we have here, this is a 9th century from a shrine at Kintilidaj-Rud. We have an example, 8th century shrine at Kintilidaj-Rud, northern shrine, we have a sketch of an image that is remarkably similar to other images we have of the tree of life elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The tree of life is a mythical tree that was understood to, and you can see it even here, is often represented as having these flowers or fruits coming off of its branches. So it's typically in sort of bloom state when you see this. And you'll often see human figures, but more often you'll see animal figures getting up really close to the tree in order to eat of it, ibexes especially. And the notion was if you ate of the tree of life, it was, as you would imagine, life-giving, healing, nourishing, sustaining. It doesn't always have a connotation of immortality, but it always has this notion of enlivening, empowering. In the Bible, the tree of life occurs in 3 places. You find it in 3 places, and I think it's pretty remarkable. And I'm going to digress into being a wisdom scholar for just about 2 minutes. You get it here first in the Garden of Eden, where by the end of the story, it's a story about wisdom and desire, a story about knowing good and evil. It is cut off and not available to humankind any longer. The second place you get the tree of life, described in some quite vivid detail, is Revelation. The very last chapter of the book of Revelation. The tree is described as having rivers that flow out from it, and its leaves, it blooms every month, and the leaves, it gives different fruits every month, and its leaves are healing for all the world. It's available. Tucked in the middle of the Bible, you all know me well enough to know where I'm going. Tucked in the middle, the tree of life is wisdom personified, who is standing in the middle of the city streets, calling out to the naive and to eventually all Adam, all humanity, to come and learn from her. Proverbs 8. Proverbs 3 is where she's particularly, 3:13 to 18, she's particularly called the tree of life. What's kept away from us, blocked from our access at the end of Genesis 3, is standing in the city streets in Proverbs, wisdom personified, knowing, knowledge, awareness, alignment with God's purposes in the world, and is ultimately in its fullest expression in Revelation when all the world shall eat and be healed by the tree. So, trees are dropped at the beginning and will have resonance across the tradition, both Jewish and Christian.
Yes, complicated question. They aren't forbidden to eat from the tree of life.
Yes. They're not
there. Any ideas?
In this story?
At the beginning.
Yeah,
They're
no, that's
forbidden
right.
to eat. There are 2 trees
Yes.
besides all the other trees.
Yes,
They're told, there are 2 special trees. They're told not to eat from one of the special trees.
but not the
They're
other.
not told not to eat from the other special tree.
Who knows? Some say that the sort of the 2-tree piece is in order to get the tree of life in creation at the very beginning. And so it's not the concern of the story, but it is a way to anchor that tree as being part of the original Edenic. And for Christians, then, it later makes sense in the fullness of Revelation. The tree will be restored. But it's mentioned, and then it isn't a problem until the back end, right? This closing scene, where if they eat of that one tree, now they will likely eat of the second tree, and that's a problem. Last word.
Yesterday you said that there are those who argue that the serpent just told the truth.
Or ask questions.
Well, I mean, what he said was told that, and he was punished for telling the truth.
Yeah.
What is there wisdom in that? Why is that? I mean,
Think of the oath in courtrooms. The truth. The whole truth.
The whole truth, that's right. Yeah, usually, that's right. So the serpent, what you'll typically see in interpreters, is a great question. What you'll typically see in interpreters, and I think it's right, is the serpent doesn't actually tell the whole, doesn't ask the full question. His questions are sort of coming at the truth slant. He is quoting and using speech that's resonant with what God said, but not saying the whole thing. And so where typically people will come down on the serpent's consequences is that the serpent played with the truth, adapted the truth.
he told the truth.
told the truth, but
Not
not
the
all
whole
of it.
truth.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's so. But even so, the other way to play that, even if you want to say the serpent told the truth, and the serpent suffers. Another way to come at that is to say we need to be fully aware that our choices have impact on creatures and creation and others beyond our control. Right? So the fact that we chose poorly does actually have ripple effects in creation. That will come back later when we think about the whole way Israel understood the moral universe to function. So the created order struggles and suffers at our hand and is called in to right wrongs of our own doing. So it's a much tighter net for the Israelites than it is sometimes in our own thinking. Any other questions before we move to Cain and Abel? Because the story's just going to get happier and happier. Okay. Shall we move? To move us, to transition us into Cain. Yeah, this is the up with people night. Is everybody there? This is the really, yeah. I wanted you to see this wood carving, which I think is just beautiful. It's for the Cathedral of St. Matthew in Italy. And it's preserved at the Louvre Museum in Paris. But it's this really exquisitely done. I don't know if you can quite see all the detail. The relief, this 3D sort of sense. 3D, 2D.
It says
Yeah, the ivory. Yeah, it's just really. But you see the two brothers with their offerings and the hand of God coming and pointing towards Abel. And then you see the conflict, actually, and then you see the extended hand, talking about grace, right? You see the extended hand of God, who looks remarkably like Jesus Christ, with Cain is sort of, I'll show you a couple other art depictions of Cain after the fact, but that sort of shame, the hand bent in flight. And one poem, Rainier Maria Rilke's poem, I read it here in your very word. First time I read this, I kept rereading it. It's just about this story, so I'm going to read it as we transition to the narrative itself. I read it here in your very word, in the story of the gestures with which your hands cupped themselves around our becoming, limiting, warm. You said live out loud, and die, you said lightly. And over again, you said be. But before the first death came murder. A fracture broke across the rings you'd ripened. A screaming shattered the voices that had just come together to speak you, to make of ours a bridge over the chasm of everything. And what they have stammered ever since are fragments of your ancient name. So we could call it a night with that. I don't have anything that eloquent to share with you. I just think that's fabulous.
What does that mean, before the first death came murder?
What do you
Adam and Eve were still before.
Yeah, and one of the questions we're going to see in this narrative is if the traditional readings of this text come down very hard on Cain when we get there. There's a question, rightly. And yet, this is also the first time death enters the world of the characters. And we're going to see Cain wrestle with what that means. So what is death exactly? If you've not seen death before and don't have a notion of death, what does that mean? So we'll see if we can hold our suspense and see what happens. So, and now I've got my PowerPoint special effects for the night. Okay, so tell me, even if you haven't reread the Cain and Abel story for tonight, what is it about? What is this story about? Jealousy. Interesting. What else is this story about?
Rivalry.
Sibling rivalry. Excellent. What else is this story about?
God made a choice.
God made a choice. God's freedom to choose. What else is this about? Anger. Violence.
Shame, is it?
Shame. Word doesn't occur here, but shame.
Self-control,
Lack of self-control. That's going to be that's really going to be at the heart of the question. Consequences for action, again, right? We're starting to see a pattern, yes? Every story has actions and consequences. What else?
Temptation crouching at the door.
Sin crouching at the door, which we'll talk about. Sin itself.
But
is
the
crouching.
temptation to sin.
Yeah. What else? Good.
And alienation between brothers.
Oh, brother. I mean, brother, the word brother recurs 7 times in this story. And every time Abel is mentioned, almost every time Abel's mentioned, Abel his brother, Abel his brother, Abel his brother. The story is about brotherhood. What else? And what does it mean? What does brotherhood mean? What else? Okay, so you can see why. Oh, please.
This is derivative of God's choosing, but there's something about adequacy of the gift.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so we're getting to the adequacy of the gift. We're going to have a great conversation about this text because your responses are actually coming out of 2 major streams of tradition with regard to how to read this story. So we're going to highlight that. Anything else that you want to have? So can you see why actually when you think about all the various topics that you've thrown on the floor as what this story is about, you can see why most modern translations go simply with the title Cain and Abel. Right? They don't say sibling rivalry, they don't say the first sin, right? The first time the term is used. And Cain and Abel itself, the 2 names together, the brothers' names together, encapsulate, for people who know this story, all of these various connotations that you just named. The story is only so many verses long, and it's thick with all of these various aspects. Some of which you may find you accent in your own reading of the text more than others. I'm going to try to sort of open it up as we go along and see where you sit and see if you say the same thing at the end of the night you say at the beginning of the night about what the story is about. Okay, let's ask ourselves, what do we know about Cain and Abel, since they're the figures on the stage? And let's look at chapter 4. I want us to focus first on just the first couple of verses, because the narrator is doing something interesting here. The man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Okay, we got to start first with Cain. Adam and Eve have sex. Eve becomes pregnant. Eve gives birth to Cain, and there is a naming formula. The firstborn is a son, and the firstborn gets a naming formula. And it's quite a remarkable naming formula. Did you all catch it, actually? She says, I have produced, the Hebrew word is Cain, kana. I have new markers today. Kana, I'm very happy. Kana. So Cain comes from this. Kana is the verb to acquire, to purchase, to buy, has the sense. It can have the sense of bearing, typically birthing, particularly when it's gods. But here in the case of Eve, it might have resonance. But what she does not say, so she says, I've produced a man, an ish. She does not say, I've produced a bane, a son. She doesn't say, I've produced a yeled, a boy. Right? She says, I've produced an ish, a man. What does that do? What do you think that's about? Anything? Maybe nothing. You're like, I have no idea.
It's still goes back to God. There's little parallels.
So we're hooking back, right? Now, one of the things, these have been put together over time. But one of the things that's definitely we're going to start to see the further we get in, is that stories anticipate and stories reflect back. So as soon as you hear ish, what do you think of? The ish and the isha at the end of 2, right? This man and woman, right? So this adult, this Adam. There's also a way in which, by saying, I produced a man with the help of the Lord, that she is already moving us in the story. One of the things you're going to notice is that the Cain and Abel story doesn't care a whit about their childhood. Right? We're going to actually leave it in 2 verses, where they're going to get born and then they're going to work. There's nothing about, there's no lollygagging around in the narrative about whether they got along when they were kids or whether they, played together well. There's none of that. We're going to get that later with Isaac and Jacob, right? Yeah. Isaac and Ishmael, excuse me. We don't get that here. This story is moving us to a critical moment in adulthood. And it starts with the birth formula. I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. This is not immaculate conception. It's simply a way to attribute pregnancy and birth to the divine hand, which is the way it was understood in the ancient world. God has blessed you. God has made it possible for your womb to be open. Conversely, if your womb is closed, it is a curse upon you. Okay, so Cain gets a naming formula. This is quite literally he means the acquired one. His name also has sound play with smith, like a metalsmith, like a craftsperson. Later, he will be alienated from the land, and his descendants will be the originators of the arts, and arguably of culture. And so some say that it's already a sort of premonition of his alienation from the soil that he's supposed to work. Okay, then let's meet Abel. Next, she bore his brother Abel. That's it.
This is the first sense of relationship. That she doesn't have a son, she has a man. And so the first description of relationship is brother to brother.
Excellent, excellent. So you're not getting at this notion of child, you're getting, it's a man. And now we have his brother. Notice the first way Abel's introduced is his brother. And then it's Abel. And Abel comes from the root, that's not going to help you, Hevel. Hevel is, you all know Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes is, the refrain in the book of Ecclesiastes is poorly translated into English. Many modern translations is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It really means, Hevel is really a mist, vapor. It's the thing one cannot grasp. So the point, Hevel actually probably has multiple meanings in the book of Ecclesiastes, but one of them is the inability to hold on to something, right? You can't grasp it, you can't hold on to it. Hebrew readers of the story of Cain and Abel, when they first meet Abel, what do you already know about Abel? He's not going to be on the stage for very long, friends. His name means mist. It's the same in the book of Ruth. The 2 sons are Malchon and Kilian. Consumption and disease. That's what their names mean. They're not going to be around for very long. So the narrator's cluing you, right? This may actually be, he may be an important figure, and he is, but you're signaled by his name. He's not going to be around for very long. Plus, he doesn't get a naming formula. A birthing formula. Now, did you also know, what do you also know is going to come down the pike when you think about the relationship of sons later in the book of Genesis?
Well, he's the second son. He's the younger son.
The younger son. And one of the things we learn about God and about the way these story worlds work as the further we go is that God loves to overturn social convention. And the social convention in the ancient world is that the firstborn son was the one who received the inheritance, was the next sort of leader of the family, was the next patriarch. And you step into it and you think, Cain is it. And Abel is rightly sort of this wisp, right, literally, of a figure, the second-born son. We're going to find right away something turns differently in the next couple of verses, right? So we're starting to anticipate the inversion of brotherhood later in the book of Genesis. Okay.
Do we have any
Yes,
idea
please.
of how much distance, how much difference in age there might be? Because I've read this before and thought, are they twins? I mean, could they have been from the same pregnancy?
We don't actually even get, then Adam slept with Eve again. Right?
Yeah.
You don't even get the moment of conception. You get all of that with Cain, but you don't get it with Abel. We don't know. So, and actually, it's an interesting question because in some artistic depictions, like the wood carving, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, and it keeps catching my voice. In some, you'll see them relatively the same age, same height, same build. In other depictions, you're going to see one is notably older, Cain. It just depends on who the artist is and how they render it. It's a gap in the narrative. Shall I move? Okay, so here we go. In the course of time, okay, so, oh wait, I'm sorry, I skipped a verse.
Yeah.
Abel was a keeper of sheep, Cain was a tiller of the soil.
Does the Hebrew explain why it's that way?
Why it's which way?
Like, did they choose that? Was it just
Wouldn't that be great if the Hebrew gave us all that subtext? No, this is what you get. Now, what is interesting is you now got two different kinds of workers, right? To this point, what did you know our vocation was? Tilling the soil. So Cain, if you don't know where the story's going, Cain actually looks like a remarkably normal, well-adjusted human being, right? He's firstborn, he's got a naming formula, his name means something significant, he's been given as a blessing by God, and he's actually doing the labor that we were told to do in the garden. Yeah, he's a clean character to this point. But we also get, if I can say that, but we get this introduction of the shepherd, or the keeper of sheep, alongside it. So some more historical critics of this text see that this was maybe a story that was originally crafted in order to explain tensions between shepherds and farmers. As an etiology to explain conflict between two different kinds of laborers. In any case, in the course of time, so the narrator, they've grown up, right? They have vocations, and now we're to the moment. We're building to the moment. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. Okay, we'll go to the next verse and we'll talk about it. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, the Lord had no regard. I'm going to read this one more time. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, the Hebrew's a little crisper, and Abel, also him, right? There's a sense in the Hebrew, Abel's kind of running behind, right? Sees it and follows cue. Abel, also him, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, the Lord had no regard. Here's where the interpretive streams apart. And we were doing it when I said, what's this story about? The first thing somebody said was it's about sibling rivalry, jealousy. Someone else then said it's about God's freedom to choose. Okay, so if we think about the first stream says, this story is ultimately, the crisis of this story is that what my question is? Yeah, the crisis of this story ultimately is between the brothers and the quality that they bring, the quality of the offering that they bring. And a lot of ink has been spilled to argue that Abel's offering, because the narrator makes sure you know that's from the firstlings, and it has it's the fatty portions, it's the good stuff. It's the marbleized meat. It's the good stuff. The narrator wants to be absolutely sure you're clear, this is in this stream of interpretation, that Abel actually somehow knew much later developments in terms of sacrifices and offerings, knew regulations that don't have to be in place for the story to be told, and somehow knew to bring, even as a secondary move, following Cain's lead, a very fine offering. And that this story is about God's preference for the meat sacrifice.
So God is the guilty part.
Oh, so God is the guilty part. Okay, which brings me to the second move. The second move says the offerings are the same in quality. They both brought of their daily labors. There is not yet an understanding that one kind of offering has more merit than others, or that one has to measure the quality of one's offering. One brings from one's produce. And Cain does it first, seemingly freely, of good instinct. So readers in the first strand of interpretation who say, really this is about the brothers' jealousy, competing, vying, one trying to top the other by bringing, Abel trying to top Cain by bringing a better offering, ultimately are going to focus a lot on the envy between the two brothers. Surely, here's the implicit rationale behind this argument. Surely the reason why God prefers Abel's offering can be understood through the law codes. Surely the reason why God prefers Abel's offering is because it makes sense. God would prefer the marbleized meat to the freely given grain offerings. Do you hear it? God, here, I'll now summarize it. God must behave in ways that make sense to us. So the reason God prefers Abel is because clearly his sacrifice, his offering, was better.
If you can go cynical.
Okay, well, now I'm coming to the other side, to the other
This
interpretation.
is, we're talking about chapters written by the priestly class.
Edited eventually, yes. Go ahead.
This is how they made their money.
True.
They made
True.
their money by taking offerings of great value, namely meat.
True. But
And, I mean,
see, here's part of the question. Do you impose all that on this narrative world, in which case you start arguing about the quality of the offering, which I'm sorry, I put all of you in that first strand of interpretation to sort of model this. So it becomes a self-perpetuating argument. The problem, the crisis in the text is prompted by the quality of the offerings the sons bring. The other and more difficult strand, which you all know represent, the other strand of interpretation of this story is to say the crisis in the story is because God has absolute freedom to choose to have regard for whoever God wants to have regard for. And sometimes it's going to be you, and sometimes it isn't. And the decision you have to make in the moment is how you're going to respond. So one of my colleagues has, outside of his office door, I was thinking about this text when I was walking by, he has this sign outside his door that says, "Yes, Jesus loves everyone, but I am his favorite." Right? Jesus loves everyone, but I am his favorite. So the story, you can either hinge your interpretation over brothers vying for God's attention and the quality of the offering, or you can say, and it's a much more difficult theological ground on which to stand, the crisis is that God can choose what God wants to choose. And God will sometimes behave in ways you don't understand or that you even find appalling.
Seems to me that verse 7 suggests a different interpretation.
Say it.
Verse 7 suggests to me a different interpretation from either of those.
Which is?
Have we read verse 7 yet?
Have I gotten to verse 7
Which is
yet?
that God can read your heart.
Ah!
Yeah. And he knows something about Cain that isn't apparent from the actions.
Yeah, and how this spins out will depend on that. Yeah, I think that's a corollary of one of these two major trends. There was a hand. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say it's the original Life is Not Fair story.
It's the original. Yeah, it starts here, right? Now, what that prompts, of course, is a reaction from Cain. Actually, both strands of this interpretation can address this reaction by Cain, right? I brought you an offering, and somehow it was valued less. But Cain gets very angry, and his nose burns in the Hebrew. When you're angry, your face, your nose is on fire. So if you've ever seen it, we've all seen somebody really mad, right? That's actually what happens, right? They say it the way it is. So Cain's nose is burning, and his cheeks fall, his face falls, his countenance falls. It's a combination of rage and disappointment or shame, right? Hanging the head. God says to Cain, so how does God engage Cain? How did God engage Adam? Another question. Same thing happens here. Why are you angry and why has your countenance fallen? Okay, God has regard for Abel's offering, but has not stopped watching Cain's reaction. And in fact, uses the narrator's own language to mirror back to Cain what's happened. So God's perception, at least in the narrative world, is correct. Cain is angry, and his face did fall.
I don't blame him that he's angry.
I'm sorry?
I don't blame him that he's angry.
Oh, of course. Of course. Either way you sort of want to read the crisis of the text, it's understandable. It's a quite understandable reaction to be angry about this. But here's the theological crux in verse 6. The Lord says to Cain, verse 7, which is what Rob was pointing us to, if you do, and the Hebrew here is very cryptic, but it's basically, If you do well, will you not be lifted up, is what the Hebrew is, nasa. Lifted up as in, nasa can have a sense of being forgiven, being carried, being born. So if you do well, will it not go well with you, is essentially what it's saying. Not do well, yatab, if you do not choose well, sin lurks at the door, its desire is for you, and then we run into a really critical word. So what do you learn about sin in this verse?
It's waiting for you.
Okay, so first of all, sin is external to the self, right? Sin is not innate in the human being. There's a door involved here at least, right? So sin is external. And what prompts the entrance of sin into the story? Its desire is for you, but when does it appear on the stage? If you choose poorly, suddenly it's there. There isn't really, no, there's a lot of debate over, is it always there and you're just now suddenly aware of it? Or is it actually sort of called into existence as an external reality when one chooses poorly? Then what's also interesting is the notion here, sin is like an animal. It's animated. It's got a verb action to it, both this notion of its desire, but it's also at the door, crouching. Excuse me, it's cold. The verb, this notion of sort of crouching, it can be read either as like repose, cattle lie down and rest, right? It's that sort of just resting and waiting. It also, in a couple of texts, has a notion of sort of a lion on the prowl, waiting at the door, ready to pounce. Some interpreters read it more aggressively. Some readers read it more passively. The verb sort of affords both. But there is this sense that you're not going to get out your door without sin encountering sin. It's waiting for you. Okay, but then you get, somebody read the end of that verse.
Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
You must master it. The root here is mashal, to reign. Mashal, this is SH, the SH thing. And it's in the imperfect, is the form. Sorry, a little minor Hebrew lesson here, but here's where it's going. You have three options in the imperfect, and you've got to decide. We are now the new Lewinsville Presbyterian Church Revised Version of the Bible, and we need to decide, are you going to translate this, you will master it, in the sense of future, as the imperfect can be used? Are you going to translate this as you may, or can, which is the modal sense of the verb, which can happen? Or are you going to render the imperfect, you must master it, which is the hortatory use of this verbal form? How many of you want to serve on a Bible translation committee? Which do you choose and why? All three are viable options with regard to the Hebrew. Sin crouches at your door. You will master it. Is anybody using a translation that has that translation?
You've got the King James, which says, thou shalt rule over it.
Thou shalt rule over it, so that's good. You may or can, or you must. Okay, let's just take a vote. And I won't look. How many of you will go with the simple, you will master it? Okay, so if we render, so if the committee moves and renders, you will master it. What is that signaling? What does that connote?
Confidence.
Confidence, right? You're going to be able to do this, right? Go, Cain. You're going to be able to do this.
Go do it.
Okay, how many of you would want you may or you might? You may or you can. Excuse me, the modal. And why is that the preferred translation for those of you who raised your hands?
You may or may not.
So the emphasis is more on the choice, right? In the same, we're seeing all these characters faced with choices, right? And in this case, Cain has a choice. You may, it's possible, we'll see, right? There's more of that, let's wait and see what happens.
Or perhaps you can do it, or perhaps you can't.
Yeah, perhaps, exactly. How many of you want to go with you must master it? The bulk of the room. Why?
But only for one reason. And that's because I think you must include, you may or can. It includes God's confidence that you are able to, or else God wouldn't require you to, or say that you should.
So you're going for the umbrella theory of translation.
I think I'm doing it as an optimistic thing, not as a finger waving. You must do this. It's you must, because you have this bit of divine in it. You have the power. You have the ability. You can do it.
Good.
It also implies an urgency.
Lots of hands coming up to respond, Rob.
I like must because it implies, to me, it implies the or else, the consequence. We've all, those of us with kids, or maybe even nieces and nephews, have occasionally said that. You know,
It's the unspoken or else.
It's the unspoken or else. Excellent. It's the unspoken or else.
You must do your utmost to do that.
It's urgent. So it's about urgency of the decision, right? It's urgency, there are implications and consequences. Yes.
Yeah, it's like divine counsel.
It's like divine counsel.
I'm telling you.
I'm telling you right now, you really have to do this. Okay, notice it doesn't matter where you ended up. Oh, please.
I was just going to say that maybe you must, not in the sense of sort of command, but you must because that's how I created you to be, and so you're going to master it.
Yeah. So it's actually a confidence, and this is part of the intention.
But the next 12 or 15 verses are the or else.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So do you read it sort of apart, or do you read it?
No, it's in the context.
It's in the context of the whole thing. Good biblical interpreter. Okay, so one of the and actually modern translations are split on this, because it doesn't hinge on the Hebrew. It hinges on how you're seeing the character of God in the story and how you're seeing the character of Cain. So all of you are making decisions. Is God encouraging Cain? So notice, even when you made your decisions, it wasn't simply you may or you must, but you put tones of speech to it. You may, or you will, or you either, you must, or you must. It's part of, it's part of who you were created to be, right? You can add tones of voice on top of interpretive options, and the water gets even murkier. In any case, what's clear is in the next verse, Cain is not going to be able to do it. Oh my goodness. So Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out in the field. When they were in the field, he rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So
We know nothing about
He
the
never even
conversation.
tried.
the other thing is we don't know. Actually, in the Hebrew, you lose the whole "let us go out in the field." It's missing. Actually, in the Hebrew text, you probably see a footnote. It says the Hebrew's missing. What Cain says to Abel, they're just really suddenly in the field. It's a textual error, but it's sort of an interesting textual error. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Now, here comes God on the stage again. I'm going to move this a little more quickly. The Lord says to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Okay, did you notice, first of all, how does God intersect with the human? With a question. Where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Okay. Is Cain lying?
Sure.
Yeah.
Does he know what death is?
Is Cain lying? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?
No, but he is lying. He knows what
This is the first thing to death. He may not know.
Okay, so somebody's saying, absolutely, he just killed him, right? He's lying on the field right in front of him. Others of you are saying, wait a minute, this is the first moment of death. This is the first time when the life breath departs from the body. That which animates the self is no longer there. So some interpreters over time have said, it is possible, depends on how you want to read Cain, right? That Cain is looking at a lifeless, dusty body and actually doesn't know where Abel is. That's one reading of this. It's actually got deep roots both in Christian and Jewish understandings of the story.
It sounds like it was an accident.
It's quite deliberate. It's murder. There's no question about it. But the result is he's dislocated. He's alienated from his brother. He doesn't actually know where Abel is.
I buy that. He was here a minute ago.
He was here. Yeah. Poor Cain. Okay, so, not poor Cain. But in any case, so
What's
once...
implicit in the word slew?
Yeah, no, it's clearly, there's no question, it's clearly murder, right? This text is the first murder. But the theological question that's the response prompts is what I'm trying to press. And that is, for some interpreters of this text, in both Jewish and Christian interpretation, there is a thread that says the moment of death, the first time one experiences the brother's death, it is a profound moment of alienation. We've not yet had this kind of alienation. We start with alienation of bodies, right? Alienation from one another, alienation from God, alienation from the soil. Now you have alienation from the brother. Cain may actually be saying, I don't know where he is. He's not moving. I don't know where he is. Doesn't say he didn't commit the crime. It's just saying he doesn't know how to interpret the aftermath of the results. But then he responds. A further thing he responds with is to say, am I my brother's keeper?
Yeah, that sounds like he is.
So that prompts the Midrash, Jewish tradition, to say, who actually is the keeper of the human community? Who is the shepherd of shepherds?
Oh, God.
God is.
Blaming God again.
So is Cain here saying, am I supposed to be the keeper of my brother? You're the keeper. Right? It's, again, mirroring, remember, these texts all bleed one into the other, mirroring the same passing of the buck. But here's what the Midrash does. As soon as the Holy One, blessed be he, said unto him, where is thy brother Abel? Cain replied, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Thou art the keeper of all creatures. Notwithstanding, thou dost seek him at my hand. Sorry, this is the way this translation was. To what may this be compared? To a thief who stole articles by night and got away. In the morning, the gatekeeper caught him and asked him, why did you steal the articles? To which the thief replied, I stole, but I didn't neglect my job. You, however, your job is to keep watch at the gate. Why did you neglect your job? Now you talk to me like that? So too, Cain said, I did slay him, because thou didst create in me an evil inclination. Thou art the keeper of all, yet me you allowed to slay him. Thou it was that didst slay him. I'm doing terrible job. For hadst thou accepted my sacrifice the same as his, I would not have been jealous of him.
It's all your fault.
But notice we're getting generation after generation, right? So this is where we start to get. This whole notion that what happens in 3 with Adam and Eve starts to descend, be passed down generationally through Cain and the death of Abel, and it's going to widen as we move towards the flood. So Cain, I know it's almost. So Cain, God then says, "Am I my brother?" And the Lord said, "What have you done?" If you want to look for a refrain in the book of Genesis, what have you done? What have you done? What have you done? Is one of them, both on the lips of God and on the lips of Pharaoh and other characters. Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Okay, now this is, we've had sin animated at the door. Now we have blood actually crying out from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground. The ground had been cursed in 3, right? Now Cain is actually separated, cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Okay, if you're not catching the repetition of ground, Adamah, 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 is happening here. You're now even further alienated from the soil.
And that's what he did.
That was his job.
Yeah, exactly. He was the worker of the soil. Now he's even further alienated. By the way, that's another reason why some people say his offering was inferior, because it came from cursed soil. In 3 it was.
In the garden.
In 3 it was. It will give you brambles and thistles. So this is yet another reading in, right, to say, well, the reason why his offering was inferior is because it's from cursed ground. My punishment, Cain says, is greater than I can bear. Today you've driven me away from the soil. I will be hidden from your face, fugitive and wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. The The Lord said to him, you may be wondering who are these people because so far we only got we don't know. The narrator's not concerned about it. There are lots of people out there. The Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. One of the important things to note, and it's going to recur in the very next chapter, which I'll point to at the end here, is this notion of vengeance. Vengeance for Israel is the work of God. Vengeance is not the work of the human. Vengeance is not the work of the human. Vengeance is the work of God. So if you're crying out for vengeance, the Psalms, right? The Psalms will give voice to you. Cry out for vengeance from God. You do not execute vengeance or revenge on your own. Vengeance is only the purview of God. So whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord marks Cain. If we knew exactly what this mark would be, there's all sorts of options. And Cain wanders off. So this notion of being disoriented from the brother, divided from the brother, now separated from the soil and being a wanderer in the land, God nonetheless, right, stays with the figure of Cain by marking him, even in the land of wandering, even as he's going off a wanderer. The mark, of course, both signifies blame and it signifies protection. So the mark has a double fold. It is about consequences and it is about a way forward. Protection. Recurring themes. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. Yes?
That's sort of an Ash Wednesday tie-in.
It is.
That we get.
It is exactly, yeah. It's both this mark of who I am and a mark of promise and protection. Very much so. All right, so can I move us towards the flood?
Yep.
Yes.
15 minutes, I promise. I'll just set the stage. Any last comments on Cain and Abel? Oh, you need
Change the disc.
So while the disc is changing, I'm unleashed. Okay, for like 10 more minutes. So it lasts for a verse, right? This wandering, this aimless wandering, because the very next verse is going to move. There's another issue of origins, explanations we need to move to. And what's interesting is that in focus, or is that just out of focus for me? Is that you have Cain finding a wife somehow, and he builds a city. So the wanderer doesn't wander for long. What he doesn't do is return to agricultural life. He begins to set up an urban context. And so what the NRSV has titled this little section as is the beginnings of civilization. What you have is 7 generations from Cain and the seven generations, which many say mirrors the 7 days of creation. Right? So we're getting the creation of a new thing. And in the midst of that new thing, that is a city, we get the emergence of the arts. So did you all catch? So we have livestock, of course, but we have the lyre, the pipe, we have bronze and iron tools. We're getting the evolution of our arts and crafts, skills. It's interesting too, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, the root, all 3 of those names, the root of all 3 of those names is connected to the root Yabal, which means productive. And Naamah, interestingly, at the very end, did you all catch the sister of Tubal-Cain? You're getting a woman mentioned here. Is Naamah or Naamah, and her name means pleasant and lovely. So some say you just get a few verses where you're given a taste of the beginnings of urban life, the development of skills, productivity, and pleasantness, a celebration of human capacity. And yet, in the very next verse, Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zilpah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. In the midst of this building of a city, this spread of urban culture, this emergence of the arts, maybe even a celebration of human productivity, The blinking red light of violence and vengeance is getting brighter and brighter. So that Lamech, depending on whether you read the man and the young man as the same figure, which some interpreters argue it is, or you read them as two separate figures, Lamech here understands vengeance to be his own charge, his own capacity. Jesus, of course, later is going to use the same language to talk about forgiveness, right, as they reverse this. Then what you have is Adam, so we're getting, I just want you to see that you're getting this mix. And what begins as brotherhood, murder, fratricide, is going to start to spread into violence between neighbors, between unknowns, outsiders. Adam knew his wife again. She bore a son, and she named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed, set or put, that's what his name means, another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. Okay, but the naming formula for Seth does what? God has appointed for me another child. Remember what Cain's birth formula was? I have produced, acquired a man with the help of God, and now it's God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. Seth's naming formula, Seth's name, holds within it chapter 4. The descendants of Seth can never, ever, ever forget that he is the child appointed to replace the one first slain by the brother. His name bears that story. To Seth then was born a son, and he named him Enosh. Enosh means human. And at that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. City and culture, arts, the perpetuation of vengeance and violence, the appointment of a new son to replace Abel, and then at the very end, perhaps, a notion of confessional religious practice, invoking the name of the Lord. This is when it starts to happen. You're getting that at the end of 4, in quick snapshots, you're getting the emergence of sort of civilization, which is why NRSV does it this way, or culture. But it's a very conflicted vestige. It's inherited from all the stories that precede. You can't separate them. Okay, last word. I really will stop. And we'll do the flood tomorrow. This is the list of descendants of Adam, starting in verse 5. This is genealogy. You get 2 different kinds of genealogies in Genesis. You get what we call linear, and you get what we call branched genealogies. Linear genealogies are exactly what you would imagine. It follows the line, the family line, through the firstborn son of every generation. And linear genealogies are particularly important in anchoring a family story generation to generation to generation to generation. Narratively, linear genealogies are important because they move us through time rather quickly. Right? I can move through 10 generations in less than 10 verses by simply rehearsing the firstborn son. Branched genealogies, I'll remember in grade school, I remember doing this like 4 times. Doing your family tree. You probably helped your kids do it. Okay, so a family tree is, as the branched would suggest, is exactly a branched genealogy. So you're invited into each generation, and at times you'll even be invited to know who the women were, who the children were, not just the firstborn son, and so on. Genesis will move back and forth, as it does in chapter 5, between linear and branched. And one of the things we try to train folks in seminary to pay attention to is, when it breaks, pay attention. So when the narrator says, I'm following us down firstborn son, firstborn son, and suddenly I linger over generation. Open it up. Something significant. Linear, 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 open it up. A new phase of the story is happening. In 5, I'll say this, and we'll start with Noah, which is at the end of this on tomorrow night. This is the list of descendants of Adam. When God created humankind, God made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, God created them, God blessed them, and named them humankind, when they were created. What are you being reminded of? Genesis 1. Yeah? In the image of God, God created them. But then look what happens. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image. And he named him Seth. Cue ominous music. What do you think is happening here?
It's becoming about me, not about God.
Okay, this is so the mixture that was divine clay, right? This mixture, the image of God, with the male and female, full in Genesis 1, the full human community, male and female likeness of God. Here, this genealogy is signaling we're now a step removed. We're just a step removed. I'm going to remind you right away, God made male and female in the image of God, right? We continue to be anchored in Genesis 1. But by saying now, Seth is in the image of Adam, we cannot forsake Genesis 1 to 4. We can't simply go back. We now bear the vestige of the first murder. We bear the vestige of being expelled from the garden. Our image is now mixed with that story role. And then Seth, the descendants of Seth, you can read through, actually, if you read through for tomorrow night, but there are two places in which the genealogy breaks. The first is in chapter 5, verse 21, with Enoch, who will become celebrated in the apocryphal literature later. Enoch has the distinctive characteristic of having walked with God. After the birth of Methuselah, 300 years, had other sons and daughters. He walked with God. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. He was no more because God took him. Unlike all other figures in the genealogies who die, here we get this notion of walking with God because God took him. Noah is going to have, the similar language is going to be used for Noah. Similar language is used for Elijah, right? God simply takes up Elijah. It's code for something. We're not exactly sure what. Methuselah, by the way, I got a call. This is a true story. I got a call from, the stories I tell you are true, but this is, I want to emphasize this because you're not going to believe it. But a friend of mine who works in the financial world, Wall Street, called me up one day. He was working for Merrill Lynch at the time. He called me up and he said, I got to ask you a question. He said, I've Googled it. I think I know what's going on. He says, but I just really need to ask you. And he said, I can't believe I'm calling you actually for financial consultation. He's right about that. And he said, I need to know exactly who Methuselah is. And I said, excuse me? For financial reasons you need to know who Methuselah is? And he said, well, we're rolling out, Merrill Lynch is going to roll out a new retirement plan. And we're calling it by the code name the Methuselah Plan. Do you know why?
It will last a long time.
It's going to last the longest time ever. So he said the code, he says whether we call it that or not when it actually goes to press, I don't know. But he says in-house here, it's the Methuselah Plan. And I just came from a meeting where I honestly did not know who Methuselah was. Somebody told me it's in the Bible somewhere, and so I can call it. So there you go. So Methuselah. You too can have a long retirement. We will start tomorrow night. It's now time to stop. We will start tomorrow night with the birth formula of Noah at the end of chapter 5. And here's what I'll do tomorrow night, because clearly I can't do everything I want to do. What I will do tomorrow night is we will do the flood for the first portion of the time. And then I want to make absolutely sure we talk about the Tower of Babel and its interpretation. So I'm going to put my feet kind of squarely on those two stories. I'll nod at the Table of Nations in between. But those will be the focus of tomorrow night, and I'll try to end by talking simply about crossing over into the promises and blessings of God to Abram in 12:1-4. So you see where the cosmic stories move into family stories, and we continue from there into the rest of it. So I hope to see you tomorrow night.